So today I was going to talk about one of the phrases from the 37 practices of Bodhisattvas. And it's the verse 11 where it says, all suffering comes to wish for your own happiness. Perfect Buddhas are born from the thought to help others. Therefore, exchange your own happiness for the suffering of others. This is the practice of Bodhisattvas. And actually, I haven't been working with the whole verse. I've actually just been working with one line that came to my mind I don't know, a couple months ago, and it's just kind of stuck with me as my latest slogan or phrase that I use to turn my mind. And so I've been using the line, perfect Buddhas are born from the thought to help others. And it's been, very effective in turning my mind when I see my having a lot of self-preoccupation, excessive self-concern, and just like knowing I don't want to do that and just saying that to myself and kind of turn where I want to go. And also it inspires me. And I think I was looking into two things about this. One is why this verse works for me, the different parts of the verse, and then kind of the bigger picture about that. And so I love the part that born from the thought. That's what I was first thinking about for a long time, because maybe I was always looking for the beginning of the Buddhist path or something. And the thing about being born is that's like, that's when something comes into existence. It's the start of life. And so in one way, in my mind, I think of this as like, yeah, I want to become a Buddha. And this is like step one, if a Buddha is born from this thought, then that's in a sense, a beginning. But in order for this phrase to work in its total, it's more than the fortune cookies that we just had that have phrases inside of them, right? It takes a lot more context for a phrase to help your mind. And I'm tying together in this BBC something I read the day we went to the lake, actually, and by Edward Conce. And he was talking about that things require antecedents, basis, and continuing background. And so basically, when I think about the thought to help others, that helps to turn my mind, but that doesn't happen like out of nowhere. It comes from having had so many teaching and contemplating them. And for me in particular, the thought to help others helps to counteract the self-centered thought. And so the disadvantages, I know the disadvantages of being self-centered. I know at least some of them. I know enough to help to turn my mind when I recognize, wow, that's what's happening here. This is only going to lead to suffering. This is only associated with afflictions. This is not living according to my integrity, and I'm probably not having much consideration for others in that moment. So, there's like a background of having thought about this that helps me to have those words be a benefit, because I know I don't want to harm others. I don't want to do things I'm going to later regret. I don't want to have a mind that's always dissatisfied. I mean, there's just so many things that we've contemplated and seen in our own experience that go into these short verses. And then there's also the advantages of cherishing others. And that's a beautiful way to live, actually. I mean, so many things go better. I mean, you can spend a lot of time thinking about all these advantages, but the bottom line is that this is like part of the basis of having bodhicitta. It helps us get out of the misery of our self-centeredness. It supports our spiritual aspirations. I mean, just briefly, it's easy to see how things go better when you cherish others. And then there's the part of the phrase that says perfect Buddhas. And for me, when I'm thinking about, well, why does this phrase work? What are the antecedents? What is the basis of this? What makes this happen? This is where I think the big picture really comes in, because to become a perfect Buddha, we have to become awakened, which takes a lot of effort. And so that means we have to traverse the 10 bhumis, these bodhisattva grounds, to create the causes. And for that to happen, we've got to have bodhicitta. And for that to happen, we've got to have a mind of compassion where we actually care about others' suffering. For that to happen, we actually have to put it in the right context where we see our own suffering, the whole determination to be free. So you can see how all these things are in these short phrases. And even psychologically for me and pragmatically, if I want to benefit others, it's really hard to have that attitude unless I see them in a positive light. I mean, it's just, you're just kind of like creating obstacles for yourself before you even start. If we see other people as troublesome, if we don't really have any wish to benefit them, then it's going to be hard to make this whole path work. So we need to have, the kind of equanimity that can actually find others as kind of a sense of affection for them, actually, which is why so many of these practices start with equanimity. So anyway, all these kind of things come into the mind training teachings to have an impact on our mind, to take a phrase and make it work. And the reason this kind of interested me to think about this is in reading this, Edward Conte really has a lot of, in this one article I read, he has a lot of opinions and views, and he states them like flat out, a little bit like like Jeffrey talked about Jamyam Sheka sometimes, how he just says things in a way it kind of surprises you. So he said that he was talking about when Zen came to the US, that a lot of problems arose in his mind and others who were maybe more scholarly than the generation that it landed in. It actually landed in the time of the beatniks. That was one group of people who adopted it, and that was in the 50s. And, for those who aren't familiar with the beatniks, that was a group of literary, kind of a subculture movement in this country. And these authors were exploring and commenting on American culture and politics after World War II. And so that was one group of people who took to Zen when it first came here. And so what Conte says about this is, I found was interesting. So this was with Suzuki, who introduced Zen a lot to the US. He says, if Suzuki is to be blamed for anything, it is an insufficient awareness of the aridity of the desert into which he had planted his lovely azalea tree. And this reminded me so much of when Jampel took his ordination here, and we were sitting in the writing studio having lunch with the preceptor and Chinese master, who had a temple I think in Seattle, but he was from Taiwan. And I remember him talking about how it was just such a desert here in the U.S. Buddhism was you're just like in this desert here. And so I was like, yeah, I think it was like that in the 50s too, probably. And so what Conte was saying, that was Zen was actually designed to operate within emptiness. And when it came to the West, it was transferred into a vacuum, this desert that he speaks of. And so then he explains things which I think are kind of important to think about, because just in my lifetime, I've seen, when we didn't have hardly any, I started getting interested in meditation as a teenager. So that was in the late 60s. And early 70s. And at that time, and there weren't that many Buddhist books. There were some, but there weren't very many. And so really, when Zen came here in the 50s, there was even less. So this is what he says Zen took for granted as its antecedents, its basis, and continuing background. It had a long and unbroken tradition of spiritual know-how. When you think of Zen coming from Japan or Chan from China, there was a long tradition of, hundreds and thousands of years. 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years for maybe 1,800 years for China. I don't know Japan. And then it had a firm and unquestioned metaphysical beliefs, which when it hit the US, there was kind of like a disbelief in anything. It hit kind of like a nihilistic group of people. And then there was abundance of scriptures and images, the whole milieu of a temple and a society that's Buddhist. And there was a definite discipline supervised by authoritative persons. So there was a structure of people who, held the teachings and understood the teachings. An insistence on right livelihood and an austere life for all exponents of the Dharma. And I have to say that that probably wasn't what they ran into with the Beat generation. If you've read any of their writings, austere would not be the word that would come to mind, or right livelihood necessarily. So that's where it landed. And so we've seen some other situations, other times where, like when Tibetan Buddhism first came to the US, similar. And then a strong Sangha. And what he says about that, he says, composed of thousands of mature and experienced persons, housed in thousands of temples, who could keep deviations from Buddhist principles within narrow bounds. So, I found this pretty interesting to read. And I think it explains a lot, when you think about the history coming of, what I've witnessed in my lifetime of Tibetan Buddhism, a little bit of that I've seen. Before that, the Insight tradition, which was a subset of information from Theravada. So, yeah, so you can't just plant an azalea tree in a desert and expect it to blossom in the way that an azalea was meant to, to exist. So anyway, getting back to the main point, when we use these phrases, they can't just be like a fortune cookie where you pop it open. We've had fortune cookies lately around here. And there's this one phrase and you're like, okay, that's it. For the mind training, slogans and phrases and even these concepts to work on us, it has to be kind of part of the whole practice, part of the whole Buddhist worldview. Actually, I'll add one thing onto that, sorry. When I went to Airway Heights, I remember sometimes people from the Wicca group would come to the Buddhist group because they like to meditate. And I've also met people who were in another tradition in the prison, who were in a different tradition of Buddhism, but never had learned anything about the Four Noble Truths. And it's, when you work with people who don't have any background, all kinds of things happen. Like the person I met who was doing from the Wicca group, he came because he wanted to ask about meditation. He was actually starting to lose his memory from his meditation practice. He was doing essentially objectless meditation. He had no object and he had a lot of time. And it was affecting his memory. And so I instructed him on what we've learned about meditation practice, from which Venerable Kadro will get to when we get that part of the Lam Rim. And then I came back and talked to Venerable Chodron to double check. And she said, yeah, that's exactly what he needs to do. So that's, the kind of things that happen when you don't have the context for things.